The Congress has the power to borrow money. And they certainly are using that power all the time. They have the ability, it is Congress's responsibility to regulate commerce with foreign nations and with the Indian tribes. And the reason the Indian tribes are listed is because at that time they were seen as nations. They were independent nations, the Cherokee Nation and so forth. So that's why they're referred to specifically within the Constitution. Indian tribes. Now again, in 1942, a Supreme Court decision called Wicker versus Philbin vastly expanded federal powers by arguing that the federal government could regulate intra-state commerce if its production and its consumption could affect interstate commerce. So they got into each state under that guise. Let me tell you what happened. There was a farmer, I think it was Iowa, but I better check, but it was a farmer. And at that time there were controls that were placed on the amount of grain you could produce on a local farm of a specific size. He produced more than he was allowed. So he decided, I'll just feed it to my pigs. I won't take it down to the grain elevator and sell it. I will just feed it to my pigs. He was taken to court. And based upon that, the reasoning was, wait a minute. By feeding that to your pigs, you didn't have to go down and buy it you didn't have to buy their feed at the elevator. Therefore, the elevator might not have had to buy as much from another state. This is interstate commerce, and the federal government has the right to step in and say, no, we're going to regulate that. That was the instance, the guy on the pig farm, the expansion of the Commerce Clause. According to the Constitution, the Congress is to make the uniform rules for naturalization and for bankruptcy. It is the Congress to, and this is an interesting word, coin money. Because the founders had a very healthy suspicion of paper money. Because paper money is not necessarily worth anything. There was a time that we had a gold standard or a silver standard. There had to be so much of metal, precious metal, to back up that money. And the paper money simply was a convenience. It took the place of coinage. But it was to coin money, to regulate the value of money, and to fix weights and measures. It was the responsibility to punish counterfeiting. That makes sense. If they're dealing in the area of money, they have to deal with in the area of counterfeiting. It is the responsibility of the federal government to establish, of the Congress, to establish post offices and post roads. The Congress is to establish the rules for copyrights and patents. It is the Congress's responsibility to establish federal courts under the Supreme Court. When we get in next week, we'll talk about how that works. It was the responsibility of Congress to define and to punish piracy and felonies on the high seas and any violations of the laws of nations. International law, which is very different than the way it is defined today. Number 11, it is the responsibility of the Congress, or Congress has the authority to declare war, including granting letters of marque and reprisal, which was the authority given to a ship captain on a commercial vessel to seize foreign ships as was necessary. It was the responsibility of Congress to make rules concerning captures on land and sea. So I will throw this out for your consideration. When the Speaker of the House says, I didn't know they were waterboarding people, Well, the Constitution said that's your responsibility to know that and be watching over it, so I'm not feeling too sorry for you come November, I hope. All right. That if you like her, you get out and vote for her. Number 12. It is the responsibility of the Congress, and here's another word that we lose in our way of thinking, to raise and support armies. The word raise is critical here because the founders really did not envision a standing army. A standing army was a very scary proposition to them. They had the British, quartered in their own homes and so forth. So they really envisioned that if we really come to that, we'll raise an army and we'll provide it with the monetary support and the equipment that it needs. But this is why every 2 years, funding for the military runs out in the United States. Even to today, every 2 years you hear about military funding bills. Because the Constitution says that the funding of armies is only temporary. They saw the basis of land defense as what we would call our National Guard or the Reserve militias, that we'll talk about a little bit more when we get into the Second Amendment. It was the responsibility of the Congress to provide and maintain a Navy, because they thought it was easier to get a bunch of guys together and train them and do a land defense, but you can't just kind of grab up a bunch of guys, build some ships real fast, and send them out to defend the United States on the waterways. So they wanted the Navy to be a more permanent arm of the military. Congress is given the responsibility to create the rules for the discipline within the military, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It is Congress who must provide for calling the militia into federal service, and they're called into service for 3 reasons: to protect and execute federal law. Now, whether you agree with it or not, some of us were alive then, others of us read about it in our history books, but when Dwight Eisenhower called out the military for the forced integration in the Little Rock School District, he went so far as to call out the military in support of federal civil rights laws. Militia can be called into federal service to suppress insurrections or to repel invasions, is what the Constitution says.
What's
Number
insurrection?
16. Excuse me?
What's insurrections?
Insurrections, riots, civil disorder. The Congress is to organize, arm, and discipline the militia while they are in federal service. So if they've been called up and they're in federal service, the Congress has the responsibility to organize, arm, and discipline them, but the state from which they came still reserves the right to appoint their officers. It is the responsibility of Congress to control the District of Columbia and all other federal properties, so forts, federal districts, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, those federal districts. Number 18, then, is what has been called the elastic clause, because it has been used to expand federal power. It says Congress may be able to do what it deems necessary and proper to carry out the foregoing powers and other powers granted to Congress. Now, there are those who argue that that was never meant as a blank check for Congress to do whatever it wanted to do that they thought was necessary and proper. There is a school of constitutional thought that says all that meant was It gave Congress the right to do what they needed to do to see that these powers, that these responsibilities were fulfilled. If you're going to have post offices, you got to have stamps. So Congress, you got the right to make stamps. If you're going to have a Navy, you're going to have ships. So Congress has the right to do that. But that it was meant only to allow Congress to do those things which they're specifically given the right to do. However, another very critical decision took place in 1819 called McCulloch versus Maryland. It was written probably by one of the most brilliant men that have ever sat on the Supreme Court. His name was John Marshall. And in the decision at McCulloch versus Maryland, the Supreme Court redefined necessary and proper in a much broader sense. They said that for something to be necessary, it must only be reasonably suited. It does not have to be absolutely indispensable. And let me give you an example. I could say this podium is necessary for me this evening. Now, it's not absolutely indispensable. I could stand and hold my notes and I don't have to have it. But it is reasonably suited for the job that I have to do. And that is the definition that the court in McCulloch versus Maryland took. That it doesn't have to be absolutely indispensable. It only has to be reasonably suited. Proper means that it is not directly forbidden by other provisions of the Constitution. So this argument about strict constructionism of the Constitution goes back a whole lot more than 25 or 30 years. In 1819, the court is trying to decide how much power the federal government and its agencies have that is not specifically defined in the Constitution. In section number 9, there were specific limitations that were placed on congressional authority. Congress could not forbid the slave trade before 1808, but it could begin to make it less profitable by imposing taxes. It says Congress cannot suspend habeas corpus. Habeas corpus in Latin means to hold the body. So what that means is you and I cannot be arrested and held indefinitely without being charged, and the process of due process moving forward. Congress may not pass what they call bills of attainder. That means Congress cannot find you guilty of a crime. Congress cannot pass ex post facto laws. They cannot punish a person for an act which was legal when they committed it and later was made to be a crime. They cannot increase the penalty for an offense. If by law a speeding ticket is $60 and you get caught speeding and they don't like your politics because you were on the way to some kind of a meeting they didn't approve of, okay, your fine's going to be $150. They're not allowed to do that. They are not allowed to create laws that make it easier to convict someone in a court of law by manipulating the rules of evidence. Direct taxes must be in proportion to the census. The Congress cannot put taxes or duties on items that are moving from one state to another. That they cannot put a preference on local ships or one port over another, meaning that the federal government or the Congress is not allowed to give a sweeter deal to New Orleans than it gives to the Port of Los Angeles or whatever. We could check them on